I-V-M.
I want to thank Intel for supporting our show. We're all loving working from home, but let's be honest, there are complications. For example, getting help from IT folks if your PC is down can be challenging because you can't just walk up to them anymore. Well, you'll be happy to hear that I have a solution for you, the Intel vPro platform. The platform comes packed with Intel Active Management technology that lets your IT teams remotely manage your systems and fix the problems without having to go to them. So it means more time getting your work done and less time spent on getting support. Visit intel.in/morewithvpro, that's VPRO, to discover how you can do more of what you want and less of what you don't. If you're listening on the IVM Podcast Android app, click the link that's visible to you now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. As you may have noticed over the last few months, social media platforms have been playing a far more active role in actually moderating content about the pandemic than they usually do. And of course, as you might expect, this is certain to set a precedent for the way that platforms interact with societies and with states in the years going forward, not just for pandemic-related information, but also for all kinds of information and misinformation that can be found online. So I have with me today Rohan Seth and Prateek Wagre. Hi, guys.
Hey,
Hello.
So you guys have a document that you're going to come out with on information disorder and how various social media platforms have been dealing with them. But first, can you just explain to me what information disorder means? Is it just something as simple as fake news, or like what kind of forms can it take?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And fake news personally is a term that I don't like, and I think a lot of researchers also tend to shy away from using that term, even though it has a lot of clickbaity value now, thanks to Donald Trump. But fake news itself is very imprecise, right? Because what we've seen with misinformation, disinformation is it's not necessarily always fake, it's not necessarily always news, right? So fake news doesn't really capture it effectively, and that's why the term information disorder was coined. It's essentially a collective term for misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, right? Now, misinformation is information that is false, but it's not intended to cause harm of any sort, right? So you could be by mistake forwarding or sharing information with someone that you think is true, but it turns out it isn't true, right? So the intention in that case is not to create any sort of harm.
So basically, Indian family WhatsApp groups are rife with misinformation.
You can argue both ways, but yes, I would hope that it's more misinformation. But yeah, and then so disinformation is information that is false and it is created and distributed with the intention of creating harm, right? So you know that you're spreading something that is malicious or that is false, and you're doing it anyway.
So, for example, like a certain news website whose first two letters are OP and last few letters are India.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, there's no shortage of those kinds, right?
Yeah.
And then there's malinformation, which is information that's genuine or that's true, but it's created, it's shared with the intention to cause harm. So this can actually be, it can even be personal information that's being leaked, right? It's genuine, or information being shared out of context, right? Which is fairly common that we see, especially a lot of videos going around saying that, hey, this is what so-and-so is doing, and it turns out it's a 3-year-old video from a different country, and it's shared with the context of, something that's happening now in India, right? So that's malinformation.
Well, malinformation, I mean, even though we often attach a negative connotation to it, I've also seen examples of quote-unquote positive malinformation, like on Reddit, for example. You see a lot of like feel-good kind of posts that are usually of something that happened in a different context that involved different people, that's shared using a caption that makes it seem more current than it actually is. And it usually gets like a lot of response because it kind of plays into people's need for good news. So information is really value neutral, and a lot depends on how various actors are actually presenting and putting it out there. I think that's what you guys are basically saying here, right?
Right. Do you think that with malinformation you are presupposing an intention to create harm, right? So if you look at it in terms of, let's say, maybe a Venn diagram, right, or two overlapping circles, you start with actual falseness on one extreme, and to the right extreme you go to intention to create harm, right? So on the left circle is typically your misinformation, which is false, but there's not necessarily an intention to create harm. And on the other extreme is malinformation, right? And where the two intersect is basically your disinformation. So disinformation is both false, creates harm. Malinformation, while not false, is meant to create harm, right? And misinformation, like we said, is false but not with the intention of creating harm. So I've probably not done a very good job of explaining the Venn diagram, but it's in the document, and organizations like First Draft, etc., also use that very extensively, and that's where we've actually sourced the Venn diagram from as well.
Rohan, you have something to say?
Yeah, I just want to add that generally to differentiate between misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation, the question of intent basically matters a lot. And while we find it hard to explain all of it in audio format, just as a thumb rule, remember that if the intent isn't necessarily to harm, you can classify things as misinformation, whereas if it is, then you can classify it as malinformation. Am I on point there, Prateek?
Yeah. And in fact, this is the example I think that we had used also in the tech policy course, was that let's say I get information that is magic cure for COVID-19, right? And I know it's false, and I share it with Rohan, right? So I am technically disinforming him. Rohan doesn't know it's false; he shares it with the entire batch. In that case, it's misinformation, right? So it's the intention that plays a part, and the same information can actually morph as it goes down the chain, right? Depending on the intention of the last person who shared it, and you technically call that person an interpreter, because they look at the information and they either choose to believe it, choose to reject it completely, or are unsure of it, right? They question it, but they go ahead and share it anyway.
That's actually a very elegant example. So thanks for that, guys. So let me just try to understand this a little better, right? So there's various kinds of information disorder that's being perpetuated on the internet, but a lot really depends on where it's coming from, how it's being shared, and what the intention is of the people who are being shared. So it really seems like a very complex picture. How do social media companies go about tackling this issue?
So I think here the question applies not only to social media companies, but also search engines and engines that facilitate consumption of user-generated content, such as YouTube as well. So the idea that we started out in the document with was that generally in times of a pandemic, you will have more importance being assigned to information and how you can access it. Because right now, there can be very real consequences to sharing misinformation around. And so we looked at what platforms such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, even ShareChat have done. And sorry, no disrespect to ShareChat. I said even ShareChat, but yeah, you know what I mean. So we realized that there were the 3 to 4 broad strokes along which all of these platforms have been navigating this pandemic. Firstly, it is to assign funding to credible news outlets or to misinformation fact-checking agencies and other sources that they can deviate their money to. Right? So this has depended. The size of the fund depends on how big the company is, but generally all of them have, or most of them have allocated some funds to help with more research to be able to tackle this better. Secondly, they have made changes to the user interface. So they try to highlight more credible information, and they try to source it from local authorities that are relevant. And finally, they've tried to change the way misinformation flows. So the idea is that if there is an ad that is spreading misinformation, if there's just a post by a user that spreads misinformation, and they've been able to identify it, they will generally try to downrank it or make sure that it doesn't appear in other people's feeds. So the changes in user interface, changes in information flows, and funding are basically the 3 key strategies in action that companies have taken. There's also a policy angle to it. Prateek, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so on the policy front, what we basically saw was there were 3 types of things that they did, right? In some cases, they created new policies specifically for dealing with COVID-19 related misinformation. So this was mainly, if I remember, to Google and YouTube, right? There were cases where they just modified existing policies, and so both Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter fall in this category. And it's also interesting with the way some of them have approached it. That a lot of it has been incremental, right? They started off with one set of policies, then realized that okay, they need to fine tune this because the world, you think the world will behave in one way and it reacts in another way. So a good example of that is, I think, what Twitter had to do was they had started off defining. They had some time ago defined harmful information, and early on they defined harmful information something that creates health related risks, right? And then people went and started destroying 5G towers, right? So then they had to define their harm as people going in, even destroying critical equipment or physical infrastructure or something like that. So they've had to keep responding to things. And then there are cases like TikTok and ShareChat where they've not made any changes to existing policies. They've not really updated their existing policies, but they've tried to bucket COVID-19 misinformation in the context of their existing policies on misinformation and information disorder in general.
So what exactly are platforms responding to in terms of like selecting the way that they go about things, right? So why would, for example, Facebook choose to go along with existing policies, given that the three of us have already talked about how effective or ineffective these policies actually are? Why is it that some other companies are investing in actually changing the way that they police, if I can use that term, the way they police information disorder? What really is going on in the minds of these social media companies?
Hard to say what's going on in the minds of these social media companies. I can only make inferences based on the actions that we've seen. And as you mentioned Facebook, right? So the idea was that they're going to apply the existing set of policies to take down content related to COVID-19, which I thought was interesting, because then I went and checked the misinformation policies on Facebook regarding their community standards and also regarding their advertising policies. And most of those policies do not actually advocate for content being taken down in the first place. Instead, it advocates for content being downranked in people's feeds. And that I thought was really interesting, because it's one thing to say that you use the existing policies to take down content, but it's another thing completely when you actually look at the fact that most of those policies don't actually provide you the power to take down content in the first place. To some extent, it looks to me that it will basically play along with this pandemic and take the necessary actions so that it doesn't get a lot of backlash. And if that means that they'll need to modify their existing policies and be harsher towards misinformation, especially related to the virus, they are willing to go ahead and do that.
Yeah, and my sense was that, right, when the pandemic was in its early stages, it was relatively easier to, for any of them to say, okay, this is content that's harmful, or this is outright medical misinformation that can cause, short-term harm or immediate harm to someone. And they were able to be more interventionist, more aggressive with dealing with that kind of information. But as we know, everything is political, right? And as time went on, things about COVID-19 information disorder also got highly politicized, right? And then you basically saw them trying to navigating the same kind of trade-offs that happen even outside of a pandemic, right? So, for example, it was, hey, how do we deal with political leaders making dangerous statements, right? And that's something that we've seen play out pretty much in real time, right? For example, none of them ended up taking action against Donald Trump for a lot of the stuff that he said, but they did take down posts by Bolsonaro, right? And Maduro as well, right? For specifically for COVID-19 related misinformation. Now, ultimately, when Twitter did act on Donald Trump post, it was I think it was first for their election or using their civic integrity policy, and then later on for glorification of violence, right? But even though I think they banned the inject disinfectant hashtag, which came out of one of his addresses where he said you can drink disinfectant or inject yourself with disinfectant, whatever he was thinking, right? But they didn't actually censor any of his content, or they didn't flag any of his content, but they banned the hashtags, right? So they were making these trade-offs, right? The other interesting thing that we were trying to figure out also was that how are they prioritizing sources of medical information, right? Generally WHO or CDC, right? But how relevant is CDC as a body in India, right? Not very, right? What happens when the Ministry of Health is giving out information that may contradict with WHO, right? Now we didn't see too many of these actually play out during this, but an interesting thing to consider for platforms, right? Because, and I know we've spoken about this multiple times. They tend to have a very American or Western European outlook in when they're talking about their policies or when they're defining their policies. But the fact is that they operate in, they have users in over 100 countries now, and these are aspects that they need to be thinking about as well.
So this, I think, brings us very neatly to what I think was what personally for me was the most interesting aspect of your discussion document, which is this nifty little table you guys have with 3 columns and 3 rows. State, society, and platforms. And you've tried to kind of look at how each of these are going to impact each other, both as targets and as actors. So how states will impact platforms as targets, how platforms will impact states as actors. If you could perhaps just break it down for our listeners with a few examples, right? For example, how do you think society is going to influence platforms in the years going forward, given the kind of precedent that has been established over the course of this pandemic?
Yes, it's interesting, I think. And one of the hardest parts of doing this table was limiting ourselves just to information disorder, right? It's very tempting to, once you make a 3x3 like this and you start looking at how information disorder is impacting things, it's very easy to extend it into non-information disorder things or larger question that society is facing in general, right? But we sort of tried to limit ourselves to information disorder. So someone else reading the table might think that, hey, it'll affect it in this way as well, but that's the primary lens that we've used, right? So coming to let's look at the society aspect, and I think your platform example that you spoke about, Anirudh. So the thing is that what we've seen, right, is that people started asking for more interventionist policies and behavior by platforms, right? They're like, look, this information disorder related to health information is harmful. You need to act on it. You need to take this down, right? Once platforms did that, it was only natural, right, that calls for this will continue. Like, for example, right, with Twitter acting against Donald Trump's posts, it was always a question of when, right? But I think that when shifted very significantly after they acted on other world leaders, right? Because it was then that pressure on them increased, right? And now that the other thing is, okay, now that they've acted on him or acted on his content for one kind of post, then it's very natural that this is going to extend to other types of content as well, right? So you're going to then see this call for and to use a Mark Zuckerberg term, I think you're going to see this call for them to be arbiters of truth even more. And that's an interesting space to be in, because if you look at it, you're also effectively ceding over more control to platforms, which is kind of the opposite of what the techlash was going into the pandemic, right? We were talking about taking control away from them. But with this pandemic, we basically said, hey, no, platforms, you guys are responsible. You need to do this. Now, it's an interesting trade-off, right? And it's always going to be a trade-off. But it's one thing to see how this, it's shifted in the other direction from the society platform aspect of it, right? But if you look at how society is looking at governments, right? You're also, and again, I'm limiting ourselves to information disorder and largely on a platform, from a platform perspective, right? There are, of course, there were already calls to regulate them, to regulate platforms. I think these have obviously grown louder. And again, that's an interesting thing, because it's a question of how much control you want to see, even to states, right? To be regulating platforms. And there's the other aspect of it, which is that there is also a call for governments to provide reliable information, right? Or it's more information through official sources.
Now, I will leave it to our listeners to hopefully look at the document. Please go and check out our website. Keep an eye out to see when this document comes out. But I just want to dive into this particular example of what society is going to expect from and receive from platforms in the years forward. Because, as you said, Prateek, it's a very interesting about turn from what we were demanding just before the pandemic got started to the situation that we find ourselves in today. I think generally there seems to be a kind of conception among more educated social media savvy audiences that a platform bringing, for example, Donald Trump's nonsense under control would be great for society. And that might work out fairly well in the US. But I'm just thinking, what kind of precedent does it establish for a social media firm to basically take upon itself the right to silence or promote an elected leader of a sovereign country's statements for reasons that we might not be able to fully understand, based purely or as far as we know, based primarily on the kind of expectations that they are hearing in social media bubbles? It really does establish a very significant precedent, I think. And you guys have established, I think, quite a lot of interesting ideas, some of which might prove to be quite prescient in the years going forward. So once again, to all of our listeners, please keep an eye on our website and check out Rohan and Prateek's discussion document. Before we wrap up, though, guys, any final thoughts, anything you'd like to say?
Yeah, and the only thing that I would want to add here is the big takeaway from this is that be careful from where you consume information and be conscious about where your information diet is coming from. If willing, pay for news, and so that you don't have to worry about misinformation. Also, don't consider family WhatsApp groups as a good source of news, because if history tells us anything, and I know Anirudh is going to agree with me on this, is that family WhatsApp groups do not serve as good sources of information. So, yeah.
Yeah, and just to add to what Rohan said, his was more about consuming information. Let me take the other aspect of it, which is also sharing information, right? I think, it's amazing how frictionless sharing has become. But I think it's important to also sometimes think twice before we share something, especially if we're not sure of whether it's true or not, right? I think we're at the point where it's no longer harmless to share information that we can't testify to the veracity of.
And most importantly, good intentions don't mean anything in the world of social media, given how complex and intertwined these channels through which information flows are. Intentions are everything. Critical thinking is super important. So on that note, thank you guys so much, and thank you for listening to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. We appreciate their support. It's been a fantastic week on the IVM network. I hope that you've been checking stuff out, but some of the highlights that you definitely should check out. Ashish Vidyarthi, host of Begin the Journey, was on Cyrus Says. They had a really fun conversation. I think you'll enjoy that. Uncle Please Sid did an episode around development, which was really, really fun. On Edges and Sledges, we had Adam Holyoke, former England captain. While those guys are killing it, one cricketer after the other. Definitely do check out Advertising is Dead. We talk about esports with some really guys who really know that space. Smile India, absolutely right. These guys are killing it as well. So is Pawan at Pragati. Don't forget The Original Things. Again, one of my favorite shows. You must check that out. And thanks for listening, and we hope to catch you again next week.
Namaskar, dear Bandhu. My name is Ashish Vidyarthi. These are truly challenging times, and in these times, we need hope. Do take time to listen to my podcast, Begin the Journey. Available on IVM Podcasts, website, app, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Remember, there is hope because there's one life and we are alive.